Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the second video in my small tutorial series just having a look at Blackmagic Fusion. In this video we're just going to have a look at taking a render that I rendered in Redshift and recombining it in Fusion from its multipasses. This is the render here we're going to have a look at. It's just quite short, just over 100 frames, but we're just going to go through looking at some of the passes and how you would recombine this and what you can do with that sort of thing. So this is the scene file that I rendered this from in Cinema 4D. If I press play, you can see we've just got some MoGraph shapes here animating along a spline, and there's a little bit of dynamics in there as well to stop them from intersecting. Up in the render settings, this is just a Redshift render. I'm rendering at 1280 by 720, a little bit smaller than normal HD, but I'm recording this at a slightly reduced image size, so this will be fine for now. Under Save, I'm outputting a multipass image, Open EXR, and the format I'm just using half float. As I said in the last tutorial, this is quite a good output format for multipass. You've still got a full range, your highlights aren't going to be clipped to 1. By using half float, you haven't got such a large file size as if you were going to use full 32-bit Open EXR. Under Redshift, AOVs, open up the AOV manager. You can see I've added in quite a few of these passes here, which we're going to have a look at next in Fusion. And finally, under the picture viewer, here's the render. So you can see here we've got things like volume lighting. So this is casting volumetric light from one of the area lights over on the left here. We've got specular lighting, SSS, refractions, reflections. We've got a puzzle map, which is an ID, just an RGB map for some different objects in the scene. But I've also turned on reflect and refract IDs, so you actually get the matte also reflecting and refracting, which is quite useful. We've got GI, emission, diffuse lighting, but it's quite good because this scene overall has quite a lot of different passes that we can then sort of put back together and recombine to make the final pass. So here we are back in Fusion again. I'm going to go down to my file browser, find the render that we've just done, and drag this onto the flow window. That imports it in a loader node. I'm going to press 1 on the keyboard just to load that into the viewer, and I'm going to apply our lookup table. As I said in the last tutorial, I've got this set to gamut view LUT, and under edit it's set to sRGB for the output space. I'm going to go up here to our preferences. This is our composition for this shot. And under frame format, I'm just going to match this to the render size of 1280 by 720. Leave this at 16-bit float per channel and press save. So now any mask or any other background layer that I create will also be at 1280 by 720. Go up here, you can just see that's the render size there. And also this has been brought in at float 16, which is half float. So we're all good to go. So I would usually render multipasses out to disk as separate image sequences and then bring them back into the comp separately. If you render as one big multi-layer file, while this is convenient, it does put a bit of a strain on the compositing software or even your network that has to read everything from one single file, especially if you're rendering a lot of passes. It's also not so easy, say, to split out a pass and maybe send to someone else if it's all embedded in one giant file. For this tutorial, however, I am just using a single EXR file workflow just so that I can show you how you might split this up again back using Fusion's file loader. So if I go here and select this image node, we're actually just looking at the beauty pass. Under the format, Open EXR files, if I scroll down channels, you can see red, green and blue is set to RGB, so that's just your beauty. If I make a copy of this, press 1 on the keyboard to view that instead. Under format, we can actually change what we're going to load in here. So if I go down here and I select, if I can just find it, reflections red, reflections green and reflections blue, You can see we're now loading in the reflection pass of our EXR. Now you can go through and do all of this, but obviously it's a little bit time consuming. So luckily there is a script. If I go back to our original node, I'm going to go up to script and I'm going to choose this one called HOS Split EXR Ultra. I'm going to press OK. It's basically going to run through and create all our different passes and bring those in. So we've got everything like subsurface, reflections, and all it's done is it's gone in and it's just set up these accordingly. So I'm just going to rearrange these and come back in a second and we'll have a look at sort of combining these. But before I do that, I will actually explain where I got that split EXR script from. I'm actually using this little package manager called Reactor, and a big thanks to Ceres who put me onto this. But if I open Reactor, it does take a little bit of time to open. This is a nice little tool that kind of gives you access to a lot of free third-party plugins and scripts and things like that, and installs them for you on your machine. It makes it very easy to access these tools. And if I go down to scripts, under comp I believe, there's the HOS Split EXR Ultra, so you can just select that and choose install. It's nice and easy, and I'll just put the link to this Reactor package manager in the notes for the video. So first we're going to have a look at sort of recombining this in the simplest way possible, the simplest way to rebuild the entire comp from scratch. We're just going to go through and search for a few different passes that we'll need, and typically these are the lighting layers from the shader, things like diffuse, specular, refraction, and these are basically the way that I would normally recombine a multipass from the beginning. So here we've got the beauty, we've got the subsurface here, we're going to need that. We're going to want the reflections. Puzzle mat's useful, but we're not going to use that right now. We've got diffuse lighting here. I'll take that one. The GI, I'll take that one as well. Specular lighting, grab that one. Volume lighting. Refractions. Emissions. And I think that's it. So let's just take all of these, drag them back over here, and we'll now recombine these. So I've just removed those other passes for the time being, just to clean things up and make it a little bit clearer on screen. Now we're going to have a look at recombining these. So first up, I'm going to take the diffuse lighting, drop it down here, and let's say add the SSS on top. I'm going to go here and use a channel booleans node, just type BOL. I'm going to drag the input from the diffuse light onto this little yellow triangle, which is the background. I'm going to take the output of the subsurface here and drag this down onto the green one, which is the foreground. If I go up to channel booleans, I'm going to change the operation to add. I'm going to change the alpha to do nothing. So this has basically added these two passes together. If I was to go here, you could actually blend these back. So you're now blending between having the subsurface there and not. But we're going to leave that at 1 because we want to blend these together completely. So we're going to go through, I'm just going to copy this node. Basically we want to add together all of these. It doesn't really matter the order in which we're combining the passes. Because they're all being added together, the result is the same regardless of the order, but we're just going to connect these up. So I'm going to take the output of this, drag it onto this. Let's add the GI next. Let's take the reflections, put that one in next. We'll take the specular lighting, do that one next. Now in Redshift and a lot of other renderers, sort of the difference between reflections and specular is reflections is kind of like your background reflections, your indirect reflections, and specular lighting will typically be just the sort of direct reflections from lights, area lights, things like that. So it is split up. I know it's definitely like that in Octane as well. Moving on, we're going to add in our refractions. So again, just copy this channel booleans node, put it in there, drag our refractions in. Last two, our emissions and volume lighting. So copy paste, drag the output onto that, emissions go in there, volume lighting goes in there. So from the start we've got diffuse, subsurface, GI, reflections, specular, refractions, emission, and volume lighting. And that's basically the simplest way to recombine the comp from the ground up. Now, one thing I actually forgot to consider when rendering this and recombining it in Fusion was that in Cinema 4D I had a Redshift camera tag on the camera, and that camera tag had an exposure control. Now this exposure control will affect the beauty, and if you have apply color processing enabled on your secondary passes, this will also affect those too. The trouble is this can actually cause some inconsistencies when you're trying to rebuild your comp from scratch. So if I go here, you can see this is our current comp. I'm going to go up to the viewer, it's going to go to our B buffer and load in the original beauty. If I just do an A-B compare, you can see we're actually getting some fringing around the edges of these luminant materials, and also there's a very sort of slight colour shift in the lighting quality here as well. And this is the kind of problems you can run into if you're applying the exposure control to your AOVs as well. So you can either disable the colour processing of them so they don't get affected by the exposure control, or you can turn off the exposure control altogether, and then you could adjust the exposure at the end of your comp. So what I'm going to do is go back into Cinema 4D, turn that off and re-render, and then we can have a look at combining it correctly. So back here in the C4D scene file, you can see the camera tag here, and under exposure you can see we've got exposure enabled, and this means you can control the exposure of your scene using things like shutter time and ISO, also vignetting and white point. I'm just going to turn this off to remove it and re-render. Alternatively, I could keep this on, and in the secondary passes up here, go down to the AOVs, and we could go in here and remove apply color processing. If I did this and had this still on, it would actually render the exposure into the beauty, but the AOVs would be untouched. But to be honest, I'm going to keep it all the same for now, so I'm just going to turn this off completely. So here we are back in Fusion. I've re-rendered those with the exposure control now turned off. If we go through, you can see all the channels combined again properly. And if I now compare this with the original beauty, it's a complete match. So it is worth remembering that if you are using the exposure control, this can cause problems if you're looking to rebuild your entire comp from the multipasses perfectly. Just to take a step back, now say you don't have time to re-render this, or you don't have the ability to re-render this, you can still actually fix this. What we'd actually do is we would just take our current comp and we will subtract the beauty from it, and that will actually create a kind of junk pass. Now if we remove that from our current comp, we'll actually be left with our beauty. Sounds simple, eh? Let me just show you. So I'm going to create another channel booleans, drag that into the background. We'll take our beauty, drag that into the foreground here, and in the channel booleans node I'm going to set the operation to subtract and alpha to do nothing. So what we've got here is the difference between the two renders. So this bit here, what we can actually do now is subtract this from our current comp at this point, and we'll be left with the beauty. Because it's all in floating point, all this sort of math does work. If you were clipped and you were using an 8-bit format, it wouldn't work so well. So I'm going to create another channel booleans here. I'm going to pipe the output of our original comp into the background. I'm going to take this new pass we've just created here, drag that into the foreground, and change the operation from copy to subtract and alpha to do nothing. So now we've got this comp and we've got our beauty, and the two are a complete match. One thing you do need to be aware of though using this method is you can't actually grade this comp at the moment now. Say we were to take our reflections, we wanted to grade those differently. You can see anything I put in here actually doesn't make any difference to the comp at all. whether I boost the gain, reduce the gamma, nothing changes. And the reason for that is because of this operation at the end. Because we're doing the difference of the two, any changes I do here will become a difference here. And then when we subtract that, it's actually taking that stuff that we've just done here and removing that as well. So in order to do this, it's a bit of an annoying workaround, but you actually have to duplicate the comp here. Drag that over here. So this is kind of like a reference comp. We'll actually take the output of this one instead and drag that to there. So now we can go in here and we can take our reflections and we could grade that as we want. And you can see we now are getting a difference when we do our grade. So now we've got this all set up and working correctly, we could go in and adjust some parts of our comp. Maybe to start with, we'll just add a color corrector here. I'm just going to put slight grade on the comp itself. Maybe just bump the contrast a little bit, just using the gain and gamma. Next, maybe we want to change this blue color. Again, you could just add another color corrector at the end here if you wanted to. We've got a puzzle mat here, and in the puzzle mat we've actually got a green ID for that blue part there of that material. So I could take this puzzle mat and take it into the mask of this color corrector, and then under the little tab here we could set the mask to be green. So now if I go back and I adjust the hue, we're just affecting that part of the comp. Of course this is affecting everything in the comp, like our reflections or refractions as well. So the smarter thing would actually be just to grade the passes that need it. And in this case the passes we will be looking at will be the diffuse light and the GI. So I'm going to hold shift, take that out. It's going to reconnect the mat on that one. And I'm going to go and insert that in here on the diffuse lighting, which changes that. I'm also going to press Ctrl C, Ctrl Shift V to make an instance of that and drag that into the GI. So we've got another color corrector here affecting the GI, and the two sort of color corrections are actually linked. Also want to make sure these mats are actually still connected. So that's the same effect, but it's just affected the start of the comp and we're not affecting our reflections and refractions now. You could go into any one of these, say for example the specular, and you could reduce the blend channel to kind of bring it back. You could also push it above 1 to kind of increase it. Or like before, we could actually just add a color corrector in there to tint this separately. Now one more thing I might want to do is add some glow to the scene. Now the best glow I've actually found for Fusion at the moment is here. I'm going to put this link in the notes because it's quite hard to type in. It's actually an old cached page. It's quite hard to find these days. If you go here under settings and macros, I'm going to search for a function called exponential glow. You can download this, put this into your macros folder, and it will become a tool you can load every time you start it up. But you can also just copy and paste this. If you paste it into the flow graph, it actually appears as this glow here. So if I was to take the emission here and pipe this into the exponential glow and view that, it's quite a nice sort of natural glow that gives an exponential fall off. It's much better than say using like a Gaussian blur or something like that. But it also has controls for things like the gain, the radius, and the fall off as well. So we can pipe the output of this into where our emission was going. Now we've added our glow into the comp. Now exponential glow is a little bit slow. It does look quite nice, but it can take a second or two to render in the comp, and when you're rendering out a big sequence this can take quite a long time. So I'm still on the lookout for a better glow, but at the moment this is kind of like the best looking glow that I've found for Fusion. So this was a fairly straightforward rebuild of the beauty using the multipasses. In the next section I'm going to have a quick look at rebuilding this using the raw lighting passes. So this here is the example we just kind of covered, where we're just taking our sort of primary passes like our diffuse lighting, reflections, refractions, things like that, and combining them to create the final beauty. If you view this and view the beauty, it's the same. Now some renderers such as Redshift and V-Ray for example can actually split this up further into filters and raw lighting passes. If I go over here, it gets a little bit more complicated, but it is an extra level of control you do have. So in our previous example, for example, we had a subsurface here, diffuse lighting, GI. These were sort of the first three components we added together. Here what I've got a subsurface raw, a diffuse lighting raw, and a GI raw. And we've also got a diffuse filter. And what this really is actually splitting these up further into kind of like the lighting and also the colour of the surface, like its diffuse colour. So if we were to take the subsurface scattering raw, that's just the pure lighting information, and we take the diffuse filter, and if we multiply those together, just using a channel booleans here, you actually get the same thing as the subsurface. If I go between the two, you can see it's a match. Now the same is generally true for the diffuse and the GI. I've got the diffuse lighting here. If I multiply that by the diffuse filter, we'd have the diffuse lighting. Same with the GI raw, diffuse lighting gives the GI. Now there is something a little bit wrong with this. If I compare diffuse lighting here to our diffuse lighting over here, it's pretty subtle, but there is actually a slight bit of lighting missing. Slightly more visible if I go to the GI and I compare that with the GI from earlier. And the reason for this, and I want to say thanks to Adrian from Redshift support for pointing this out and explaining this to me, is in my scene. I didn't realise at the time, but my Redshift material actually has some backlighting translucency colour to it, and I hadn't taken this into account. Now this translucency is actually taken into account in the main passes like the diffuse lighting and the GI. However, when you're using raw lighting passes, this is actually split out as a separate pass altogether. So we also need to consider the translucency GI, which is this one here, and the translucency lighting raw. And there's also a translucency tint here. So when we multiply these two together, we actually get the translucency GI. It's quite hard to see here. If I just bump up the gamma, you can see a little bit there. That's kind of the extra information we were missing. And when you multiply these two, you actually get the translucency diffuse. So you actually take all 5 of these nodes and you just add them all together now, and the result is actually the same as if you were adding together the subsurface, the diffuse and the GI. It's a lot more complicated obviously, but it does give you a little bit extra control in that you can treat the lighting separate from the diffuse colour of the surface. So going over here, this is kind of like the final setup. I've combined these all. This is the bit I was talking about earlier. So we've gone through, taken these 5 layers, I've added them together. Refractions and reflections have a similar idea. Here's the refraction raw, here's the refraction filter. You multiply these together and you get the original refraction pass from our other comp. You add that on. Here's our reflections raw, our reflections filter. You multiply these two together and you get the same as our reflections pass from the previous comp. Specular light, emission and volume light just get added onto the end as they were before, and the end result matches the beauty like this. Now obviously this approach is a lot of extra comping. There's a lot of extra passes to output. It does give you more control, but for most jobs I find this to be a bit over the top. I've probably only used this on jobs a couple of times, but for the most part you can normally get away with using this setup we used at the start here if you're going to try and rebuild our comp. Saying that, most of your jobs may not even need this level of control. In fact, often I just output a main beauty pass, some RGB mats, and maybe another pass or two. So it is always worth considering the size of the job and whether you really do need this level of control. On my last job, I knew that we actually would only need to adjust the specular and the SSS, so I just rendered out the beauty pass, the SSS pass and the specular. The comp was actually being done remotely, so I didn't actually want to have to send a huge amount of passes over an internet connection. So to demonstrate an example of what I was just talking about, doing a kind of bare bones composite, I've got here the beauty, the SSS, the specular, and I've also brought in the emission. If I was to put down a channel booleans node, if I was to add the SSS onto the beauty, like this, we've actually boosted the level of the SSS. You could also put in a color corrector here. Boost it further. The alternative to that, if you want to take it away, you could change the channel booleans node to be subtract. If I actually blend this back and forth, you can see we've actually removed all the SSS from the comp now. Because it's floating point, this kind of math does work. Same goes here. If I was to remove the specular lighting, it actually takes all the specular out of the comp as well. Now I wouldn't push it this far. When you remove all of this, you can get a little bit of sort of discoloration of the pixels. But if you're just removing a little bit, say just toning it back, there is certainly enough in there to kind of pull things back and pull the highlights back a little bit more. You could even add the glow to the emission by doing the following. If I just add in our exponential glow, just like that. I'm actually going to remove the emission from our current comp. So this is set to subtract, do nothing. Up here, I'm going to add the glow to our emission as we've done. Now, if I add one more channel booleans, and I set this to add, alpha to do nothing. What we've done here is we've subtracted the emission, then added the emission back on with a glow as well. So there's just a couple of tips if you want to recombine it in this way without having to rebuild the entire comp or output lots of passes. Technically this is kind of a hack, but ultimately as long as the render looks fine and there's no issues in your comp, you can definitely get away with this. So one last thing I thought I should quickly cover in Fusion is the idea of color correcting pre-multiplied images. So far here, all these passes actually are fine just to color correct as they are. Go here, add a color corrector to say subsurface. You can increase the gain and it all works fine. This is okay because these passes themselves actually have no alpha channel. If I view the subsurface, press A, you see the alpha is just solid. If I was to go over here, this is a render of the same thing, but I've actually just rendered the MoGraph pieces separately and it does have an alpha. The alpha here is pre-multiplied. Now After Effects would usually ask you whether your footage is pre-multiplied or straight alpha, but most other compers you actually have to sort of specifically divide by the alpha and multiply by the alpha after you do your color corrections. And the reason for this, if I just put down a color corrector, increase the gain. It's not always visible, but the edges of your alpha will actually be pre-multiplied with the background color. In this case it was black. So when you color correct it, your edges actually can get a bit of a sort of discoloration. So the key with this, as with all other compers, is you actually want to divide before you do your color correction. So if I go here and I use what's called an alpha divide, what this does is it divides the color by the alpha and actually gives you a straight alpha. If I put this on black, it's a bit easier to see. So that was our pre-multiplied. Alpha divide gives you your kind of edges back. Now you can color correct as you want, and after this chain you put back in an alpha multiply. So it is something to be aware. If you are doing color correction with an alpha channel, you normally want to do this alpha divide, do your color corrections, and then add the alpha multiply on at the end. An alternative for that, if you don't want to use this, you could actually go into your color node under options, and you've got the pre-divide, post-multiply, which does the same thing. I normally like to put it in and specifically add those two nodes just because it reminds me to do it. Sometimes you can forget if you just have this thing on. So hopefully this has been useful. Just a collection of a few tips for compositing sort of 3D renders in Fusion, stuff that I've come across over the years. I've shown a few different ways that you can combine your passes, and also some of the issues you can come across if you're not careful about, say, how you're outputting your passes, things like the exposure and stuff like that. But thanks very much, and maybe I'll have some more tutorials soon. Thank you.